Joe's winter. If there were lots of apples any year, the winter would be short, old Joe had said. So short, he'd never draw the horse rake in, and any sort of limb would be at shed. It wouldn't pay to put the wagon in, with spring hiding right behind the hill. He'd just unhitch it near the empty barn and leave it there for the brief snows to fill. In any year the apples showed good signs, his woodshed would be filled to less than half. It wouldn't help to warn he might be cold. He'd quote his apple wisdom with a laugh. If there were lots of apples any year, he had one job to finish without rest, to gather every apple to his bin, and in good time to get the cider pressed. With barrels early filled, the bungs secure, let winter come, let others look to wolves. He would be warm, and winter would be short. Spring would come on by golden pitchers full. The logger's Sunday home. He asked her to be careful on this day. One pail of water was enough to bring. You'll hurt yourself by hurrying, he'd say, with 2 full brimming buckets from the spring. Kindly, he'd help her through the narrow door. He'd scoop 1 clear, cool dipperful to drink, making a little show of draining it that not 1 crystal bead waste in the sink. Feeling her need for him in his own way, he'd check to see if all the wood was burned that kept the family warm on winter nights from heaps of icy slabs, as she had learned. This day, for once, he asked about the saw. He filed and set the teeth the best he could, letting her try it, that it draw across the way she liked it best for frozen wood. For such a day, he did not ask to sit and talk, with playing children all about. The early evening lamp was scarcely lit. The beds were made, and the dim light put out. This is Brass Knobs. I remember small, tight fists clinging to the brass knobs of harness hames, my feet reaching to touch the thick traces for stirrups, my saddle, the horse's broad back, the back pad, and the loosened reins. It was the high place my father put me to ride old Jerry to the brook for his evening drink of water. I remember grasping those shining brass knobs as Jerry stepped over rough stones coming and going. Sometimes I let my left hand wave in excitement. My right hand never let go. I think of those bright hames when I reach out now and feel my fist tightly closing around the brass knob of my cane. This is on Adams Hill. For many years Mark Adams frowned and put a torch to the least juniper he found, a springtime ritual like mending fence. His boys were young, his pasture was the pound. He marked the acres that were fit for grass with stone wall boundaries and held the line. Today the loggers asked, what good were walls dividing nothing but a growth of pine? With trees of equal size on either side and 2 walls parallel, what was the gain? They bulled this oxwork with a dozer's strength. They leveled easily Mark Adams' lane. They pushed a skid road through his barway gate, a log road wide enough for trucks to pass. They took their largest diesels for the crop and power saws to mow Mark Adams' grass. This is Gibbs Barn. Time wrought the silver finish of Gibbs Barn, the weather working always at the wood's deep grain, the kiln sun drawing the last resin of the boards, the dry fibers drinking only the varnish of rain. Some loved it for its age and lonely place, a farm left backward by the main highways. Birds loved it for its eaves and pigeon's cote, and for its empty scaffold on foul days. Its wood was fit for violins and sounding pins. It was itself a silent instrument at last. The huge beams, taut between the floor and roof, trembled inaudibly to echoes of its past. Lying now a puzzle of bent beams, at times some loose board creaks as though its stable door was opened, and one hears pitchforks rasp the wood and horses stomping on the thick planked floor. Reminiscence. Levi Sutton had had quite a career. He never lost much sleep over it, though, not as a rule. But this night was different. Maybe he'd been thinking of his younger days and trying some of his capers all over. He didn't know himself just where he was. The usual place, he thought. He reached out, and sure enough, he felt the iron bars. No such jail would hold old Levi Sutton. He let both feet do some kicking then. A bit surprised to feel how the bars bent. He stuck his head through and tried to get out, but somebody was coming with the light. He couldn't get his head back, so he stayed there. It was Ma Sutton, and she was feeling cross. "Levi," she yelled and shook him hard. "Wake up and get your head out of that bedstead. If you have any more of these nightmares, you can take your duds and sleep in the barn." Last crop. His children inherited all of Brown's land. It's well he was gone, for he would be fretting. He warned them, "Plow light, for the soil is thin," but they plowed deep for the crop they were getting. It was old Brown's manner always to grumble of stones that came up when he dug his potatoes. Little stones and potatoes, all the same size. A lifetime he hoed them to separate rows. His children dug deep. They planted no seed. They kept the old farm from the auctioneer's gavel. They worked the thin soil. They used a power shovel. The last good crop was the truckloads of gravel. This one is Jim Brown. We stood with empty pails and stared as Jim Brown's dry hill farmhouse burned. The circle of the flames grew bright. The darkened windows flared with red. And when the bared frame slowly bent, the thin line of his lips drew tight. We saw him slowly bow his head. His hillside home was lost that night, a lesser loss than one that he had known another time, when neighbors coming in had brought his only and drowned son to him. He bore his tragedies. He went on cutting grass. The chores were managed with the neighbors' boys. Rarely the church bell called when he was not among the solemn few who answered in their proper pew. And we were frightened, who were young, to hear so strong a man as he unburden there his fears and cares with loud, "O God," and awful prayers. Here's Haynes setting. A sawdust pyramid remains where once a sawmill stood. Combustion and decay eat slowly at its center, shaping a bowl for rain and snow. Winds wear the rim of its crater, scattering food for blackberry bushes at its base. The forest pushes its roads inward. It will reclaim what it has taken. A cross-section records a white inch where the whining saw gnawed and groaned in hard rock maple. A scented line reveals the wintergreen of birch. A wide red band shows where some lucky logger brought in a precious stand of cherry. Tunneled caves disclose that farmers came and carried off huge loads for stable bedding, knowing their herds would doze content in winter barns, fragrant of pine, of spruce, and hemlock. Here the sawyer might have laughed when someone came who'd over-harvested and brought a load of logs too small for lumber, ending up with nothing for his labor but 2 slabs and a streak of brown sawdust. Forbidding fruit. Loch Hale lived in a decent place, high enough so that his farm never flooded. His was the last house where one could stop when the flood came and washed away the road, making the nearby covered bridge unsafe for crossing. People striving to get home parked their cars along his field and endeavored to make it through the woods on foot to their own places. Desiring to unburden their bags of groceries, they gave Locke all the heavy items they could spare. He did have limits to the things he'd take. One neighbor thought to leave a dozen grapefruit, large, ripe, yellow, and enticing. "No," said Locke, "I won't take those. They look too good. I just might get to liking 'em.